The broadcast arrived at 03:17 Universal Standard Time, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Every screen on Earth flickered to life with the same image, a figure draped in cascading silver armor that moved like liquid mercury. Her four eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across a face that was almost human, but not quite her voice, a melody that somehow bypassed translation matrices to strike directly at the listener's comprehension centers. She introduced herself as Princess Velora Kas'thryn of the Ascendant Dominion, third throne of the Nine Suns, and she spoke with the kind of serene certainty reserved for those who have never known defeat. She informed humanity that Earth would be annexed within 72 hours, its resources cataloged, its population assessed for labor potential or cultural preservation as specimens. She noted, almost kindly, that resistance would be unnecessary because humanity's defenses were primitive, their weaponry quaint, their military doctrine laughably fragmented across nation-states that still thought borders mattered in a connected galaxy. The final image before the broadcast cut was her smile, a thin crescent of amusement, and her parting words delivered with the gentleness of a teacher correcting a child. "Do not waste lives pretending you are warriors," she said. "You are not. You are a young species playing with fire, and the Ascendant Dominion has existed for 12 millennia. Surrender with grace, and you will be treated with the dignity due to all civilizations who accept their place in the order of things." Across Earth, politicians scrambled to coordinate a response, military brass convened emergency sessions, and news anchors struggled to maintain composure while reading statements that felt like scripts from bad science fiction. In the chaos, one man sat alone in a prefab barracks on the edge of a dusty forward operating base in what used to be called Nevada, methodically cleaning a rifle that was older than most of the recruits he'd trained over the years. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hale, and he was 46 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards. He had a face carved from wind and bad decision scars that ran along his jawline from a training accident in his 20s, and eyes that had seen enough deployments to know the difference between bravado and the kind of quiet readiness that kept people alive when everything went to hell. He didn't watch the broadcast live. Someone played it for him later in the mess hall, the audio crackling through a salvaged speaker, while a dozen younger Marines stood around muttering curses and making jokes about how the alien princess probably couldn't bench press her own crown. Marcus listened without comment, his coffee cooling in a ceramic mug that had survived 3 continents and a divorce. When the broadcast ended, he set the mug down, stood, and walked outside into the cold Nevada night where the stars were brighter than they had any right to be. He thought about his daughter, Emma, who was 23 and studying marine biology at a university on the East Coast, and how she'd called him 2 weeks ago to tell him about a fellowship she'd been offered to study coral reef restoration in the Pacific. He thought about the letter he'd written her after that call, the one he'd never sent because he didn't know how to say what he wanted to say without sounding sentimental or morbid. He thought about the fact that in 72 hours, none of it might matter. Not the reefs, not the fellowship, not the careful way Emma always ended their calls with "Stay safe, Dad," as if saying it enough times would make it true. The Dominion fleet arrived exactly on schedule, materializing in orbit like a constellation of new stars that didn't belong in Earth's sky. The ships were elegant in the way predators are elegant, sleek hulls etched with geometric patterns that pulsed faintly with light, energy signatures so advanced that human sensors struggled to categorize them, and a formation so precise it looked choreographed. There were 47 capital ships, each one the size of a small city, surrounded by a swarm of smaller craft that moved in perfect synchronization. Princess Velora's flagship, the Radiant Ascension, held position directly above the North Atlantic, its shadow falling across 3 time zones. Earth's combined defense fleet, a patchwork of retrofitted military satellites, experimental plasma cannons hastily mounted on orbital platforms, and a handful of prototype fighters that had never been tested in real combat, launched an immediate counteroffensive. The battle lasted 14 minutes. The Dominion ships didn't even bother returning fire at first. They deployed shield matrices that turned incoming fire into harmless light shows, then methodically disabled Earth's platforms with surgical precision, targeting propulsion systems and communications arrays while leaving life support intact. It was a demonstration, not a slaughter, and somehow that made it worse. By the time the sun set on the first day, the Dominion had established a blockade that encircled the planet, and Princess Velora issued a second broadcast. This time, she appeared standing on what looked like the observation deck of her flagship, Earth's blue curve visible through the transparent wall behind her. She clasped her hands together in a gesture that might have been prayer or patience, and she spoke in the same measured, almost maternal tone. "You have seen the futility of resistance," she said. "Your courage is noted, but courage without wisdom is simply waste. The Ascendant Dominion does not wish to harm you. We wish to guide you. Accept our terms, and within a generation, your children will look back on this moment as the beginning of your true history, the day you joined something greater than yourselves." Marcus watched the broadcast from the same barracks, surrounded by the same Marines who had joked about the princess's bench press the day before. This time, no one was joking. One of the younger guys, a kid named Tors who still had acne scars and a tendency to quote action movies at inappropriate times, turned to Marcus and asked, "What do we do, Gunny?" Marcus took a slow breath and considered the question. He thought about the wars he'd fought, the ones that had made sense and the ones that hadn't, and how the difference between them usually came down to whether you believed the people giving orders understood what they were asking you to risk. He thought about the fact that every species in the galaxy apparently had a word for surrender, but only a few had a word for spite. He thought about Emma and the reefs and the stubborn, irrational hope that had kept humanity stumbling forward through every extinction event and dark age and moment of collective stupidity that should have ended them. "We do what we always do," Marcus said, his voice flat and certain. "We find a way." The orders came down through channels that were still half-functional despite the blockade, a special operations tasking that read more like a suicide note than a mission brief. The Dominion's flagship was scheduled to descend into low orbit for a ceremonial address, where Princess Velora would formally announce humanity's integration into the Dominion. Intelligence suggested, though suggested, was generous given how little humanity actually knew about Dominion technology, that the flagship's shields would be reconfigured during descent to allow for atmospheric entry, creating a narrow window where the ship might be vulnerable to a localized breach. The mission objective was simple in the way impossible things are simple. Infiltrate the radiant ascension, reach the throne room where Velora would be giving her address, and demonstrate to the Dominion that humanity could not be dismissed as primitive or harmless. The briefing officer, a colonel whose name Marcus didn't bother learning, laid out the plan with the kind of clinical detachment that came from knowing you were sending people to die. The insertion would use an experimental stealth shuttle that had been designed for covert orbital insertions, but never tested under combat conditions. The team would consist of 6 operators, 4 to handle security and extraction, 2 to reach the throne room. The odds of success were listed as negligible, which was the kind of honesty Marcus almost appreciated. "Why me?" Marcus asked when the briefing ended and the colonel pulled him aside. He wasn't being modest. He was 46, past the age when reflexes stayed sharp enough for the kind of close-quarters work this mission required, and there were 100 younger operators with better training and fewer miles on their bodies. The colonel looked at him with the expression of someone who had already made peace with what he was asking. "Because you're expendable," the colonel said, and then, softer, "And because you're the only one I trust to make it mean something if it goes wrong." Marcus didn't argue. He went back to his barracks, packed a go bag that included 3 days of rations he knew he'd never use, and sat down to finally finish the letter to Emma. He wrote about the reefs, about how he'd read once that coral could survive almost anything as long as the water stayed clean, and how he hoped she'd remember that even when things looked hopeless. He wrote that he was proud of her, not for the fellowship or the grades, but for the way she still called him even after he'd missed her graduation, because of a deployment he could have refused. He wrote that he loved her, which was something he'd said 100 times but never quite believed she'd heard the way he meant it. He sealed the letter, addressed it, and left it on his bunk with instructions for Tors to mail it if things went sideways. Tors, who had been standing in the doorway watching, nodded without speaking, and Marcus realized the kid was crying, which made him feel older and more tired than any of the scars or bad joints ever had. The shuttle launched at 22:00 hours from a remote facility that officially didn't exist, piloted by a woman named Captain Reyes, who had the kind of calm that came from flying missions, where failure meant vaporization rather than just ejection. The interior was cramped, designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and the 6 operators sat strapped into crash seats that pressed against their gear with every course correction. Marcus was the oldest by a decade. The youngest was a Marine lieutenant named Quaint, who looked like she should still be in high school, but had a sniper qualification that put most instructors to shame. The insertion plan relied on timing that allowed for 0 margin of error. The Radiant Ascension would begin its descent in 11 minutes, and during the reconfiguration of its shields, there would be a 3-second window where a localized breach near the aft docking bay would be possible. The shuttle would punch through, clamp onto the hull, and deploy the team before the Dominion security systems registered the intrusion. In theory. In practice, Marcus gave it a 30% chance of working, and a 70% chance of ending with all of them as vapor trails in low orbit. The shuttle shuddered as it entered the operational envelope, the hull creaking with stress as Reyes pushed the engines beyond their rated tolerances. Through the narrow viewport, Marcus caught a glimpse of the Radiant Ascension, vast and impossibly beautiful, its surface etched with patterns that seemed to shift and breathe like living things. It was the kind of beauty that made you understand why ancient humans had worshipped the sky. Then Reyes called out, "Brace," and the world turned inside out as the shuttle hit the breach point and punched through the flagship's shields with a sound like thunder swallowing itself. The impact slammed Marcus against his restraints hard enough to crack a rib. He felt the snap, a bright flare of pain that would matter later but not now. And then the clamps engaged, magnetic locks slamming home with a vibration that rattled teeth. "We're in," Reyes said, her voice tight with the kind of relief people feel when they survive something they shouldn't have. "You've got 12 minutes before they route enough power to burn through the breach. Move." The team deployed through the airlock into a corridor that was too beautiful to be functional, and too functional to be merely decorative. The walls were a pale, luminescent material that seemed to glow from within, the floor a seamless surface that made no sound under their boots, and the air carried a faint scent like ozone mixed with something floral that Marcus's brain couldn't quite categorize. The architecture was wrong in subtle ways, angles that didn't quite make sense, distances that felt stretched or compressed depending on where you stood, and moving through, it felt like walking through a dream where the logic was just slightly off. The team split according to plan. 4 operators headed toward the primary security hub to create a diversion, drawing the Dominion's attention while Marcus and Quaint made for the throne room. The layout they'd been given was based on sensor scans and educated guesses, which meant it was probably 50% accurate at best, but Quaint moved with the kind of confidence that came from trusting your instincts over bad intel. She took point, her weapon held in a low, ready position, and Marcus followed 2 paces behind, watching angles and trying to ignore the rib that ground with every breath. They passed through corridors that seemed to shift when they weren't looking, past chambers filled with equipment Marcus couldn't begin to identify, and twice they had to freeze as Dominion crew members, tall, slender figures in flowing robes that seemed to be made of light, passed within meters of their position. The crew members moved with an unhurried grace, their attention focused on tasks that involved hovering holograms and controls that responded to gestures rather than touch. They didn't seem to register the possibility of intruders, and Marcus realized with a cold clarity that the Dominion had never been infiltrated before. They had no protocols for it, because it had never occurred to them that anyone would be desperate or stupid enough to try. The throne room was at the heart of the flagship, accessible through a series of concentric rings that required bypassing security checkpoints, designed to respond to biological signatures rather than physical barriers. Quaint handled the bypasses with a combination of improvised tech and brute force hacking that involved shorting out panels until the doors opened, and Marcus covered her while she worked, his rifle trained on the corridor behind them and his mind running through contingencies for when, not if, the alarms went off. They reached the throne room with 4 minutes left on the clock, slipping through a service entrance that opened into a gallery overlooking the main chamber. The throne room was massive, a vaulted space that seemed to defy physics with its impossible height, and the way light filtered through walls that shouldn't have been transparent. At the center, on a raised dais surrounded by holographic displays showing Earth from orbit, Princess Velora stood addressing an assembly of Dominion officials who floated in observation pods that circled the room like satellites. She was smaller than Marcus had expected, almost delicate, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that made size irrelevant. Her voice filled the chamber without needing amplification, and she was midway through a speech about humanity's potential for growth under Dominion guidance when Marcus and Quaint dropped from the gallery onto the main floor. The guards reacted instantly, 4 figures in armor that seemed to be made of solidified light, moving with inhuman speed to intercept. Quaint took 2 of them down with precise shots that punched through their helmets before they could raise shields, and Marcus engaged the 3rd in close quarters, using his rifle as a bludgeon when the range closed too fast for firing. The 4th guard reached Marcus before he could recover, slamming him against the dais with enough force to drive the air from his lungs, but Marcus managed to draw his sidearm and put 3 rounds into the guard's torso at point-blank range. The chamber fell silent except for the ringing in Marcus's ears and the harsh rasp of his breathing. He pushed himself upright, his cracked ribs screaming, and found Princess Velora staring at him with an expression that wasn't fear or anger but something closer to fascination. Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture that might have been the Dominion equivalent of surprise, and she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to reconcile his presence with her understanding of how the universe worked. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice was the same melody that had filled Earth's screens, but up close it carried an undertone that Marcus's translator couldn't quite parse, something that felt like genuine confusion rather than condescension. Marcus leveled his rifle at her, his hand steady despite the pain radiating from his side, and said, "Yeah, well, we're full of surprises." He moved toward her, ignoring the other Dominion officials who had frozen in their observation pods, and reached into his vest to pull out a small device, a beacon that would broadcast a signal directly to Earth's remaining defense networks. It was a symbolic gesture more than a tactical one, a way of proving that humanity could reach the Dominion's heart even if it couldn't win the war, and Marcus activated it with a flick of his thumb before tossing it onto the dais at Velora's feet. "That's a message," Marcus said, keeping his rifle trained on her even as he felt the strength draining from his legs. "We're not warriors. We're not conquerors, but we're also not prey. You want Earth. You're going to have to take it from people who know how to make you bleed for every meter." Velora looked down at the beacon, then back at Marcus, and for the first time since the broadcast, her expression shifted into something that might have been respect or possibly just recalculation. She raised one hand, and the remaining guards in the chamber stood down, their weapons lowering in unison. "You came here to die," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "I came here to prove a point," Marcus replied, and then, because his legs finally gave out, he sat down hard on the dais steps, his rifle still in his hands but no longer aimed. "Difference is, I knew the price going in." Velora descended from the dais and approached him, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was giving him time to react if he chose to. She crouched in front of him, close enough that Marcus could see the faint patterns etched into her skin symbols or circuitry, or something in between, and she studied his face with an intensity that felt invasive and uncomfortably sincere. "Your species has no concept of surrender," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been wonder or possibly alarm. "You would rather burn than bend." "Pretty much," Marcus said, coughing once and tasting copper. "We're stubborn that way." Velora stood, turning to address the assembly of officials who were still watching from their pods, and she spoke in a language Marcus's translator couldn't follow, a rapid, musical cadence that seemed to carry multiple layers of meaning. The officials responded with gestures Marcus couldn't interpret, and he realized with a dim sort of awareness that he was about to pass out, the combination of blood loss and adrenaline crash finally catching up to him. Before the darkness took him, he heard Velora say something in English, her voice quiet enough that he might have imagined it. "Perhaps we have made an error." Marcus woke in a medical bay that was too clean and too quiet, the kind of place where dying happened with dignity rather than noise. His rib was bandaged, his breathing came easier, and there was an IV line running into his arm that fed him something that made the pain recede into a distant hum. Quaint was sitting in a chair beside his bed, her sniper rifle leaning against the wall, and she looked up when he stirred. "Welcome back, Gunny," she said, and her voice carried the kind of exhaustion that came from staying awake through fear rather than duty. "You've been out for 6 hours. Marcus tried to sit up, failed, and settled for turning his head to get a better look at her. "The others? Dead," Quaint said flatly. "The diversion team bought us maybe 2 extra minutes before the Dominion locked down the ship. Ray's got hit during extraction but made it back to the shuttle. She's stable. And the princess?" Quaint's expression shifted into something Marcus couldn't quite read, a mix of confusion and something that might have been hope, which felt dangerous in its own right. She recalled the fleet. "All 47 ships. They're holding position at the edge of the solar system. No explanation, no demands, just stopped." Marcus processed that, his mind still sluggish from whatever the IV was feeding him, and he tried to make sense of it. Velora had spent 3 days declaring humanity's inferiority, had demonstrated overwhelming military superiority, and then called off the invasion because one grizzled Marine had broken into her throne room and proven he could bleed her guards. It didn't make tactical sense. Didn't fit any model of conquest or negotiation Marcus had ever studied, and the only explanation he could come up with was one that felt equally absurd. She'd believed her own rhetoric about humanity being beneath her notice, and his presence had forced her to confront the fact that she'd underestimated them. "Did she say why?" Marcus asked. "Not directly," Quaint said, "but she sent you a message. Want to hear it?" Marcus nodded, and Quaint pulled out a small data pad, activating a holographic projection that displayed Velora's face. She looked different than she had during the broadcasts, less serene, more thoughtful, as if she'd spent the past 6 hours reconsidering fundamental assumptions. "Gunnery Sergeant Hale," the recording began, and her voice carried none of the earlier condescension. You have done something the Ascendant Dominion believed impossible, not because you defeated us, you did not, but because you forced us to see you as you are rather than as we expected you to be. The Dominion has existed for 12 millennia, and in that time we have encountered 643 species. Of those, 197 chose integration. The remainder chose extinction. You are the first to choose neither. She paused, and Marcus thought he saw something in her expression that might have been respect or possibly just exhaustion. We will not invade Earth, she continued. Not because we cannot, but because doing so would cost us something we did not anticipate having to pay. You call it spite. We call it the price of forcing a species to fight for survival rather than accepting the mercy of surrender. The Dominion does not pay prices it can avoid. The recording shifted, and Velora's face was replaced by an image of Earth from orbit, the blue curve stark against the black, and her voice became softer. Your species will be marked in our records as incompatible for integration, a classification we reserve for species whose survival instinct outweighs their capacity for reason. It is not a compliment. It is a warning to ourselves. We will not return to your world, Gunnery Sergeant Hale, but neither will we forget that you exist. Teach your children to be wary of the stars. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The recording ended, and Quaint shut off the data pad, leaving the medical bay in silence except for the faint hum of equipment Marcus couldn't identify. He stared at the ceiling, trying to process what Velora's message meant, not just for him but for Earth, for humanity's place in a galaxy that apparently operated on rules he'd never been taught. Gunny, Quaint said quietly, did we just win? Marcus thought about the question, about the 4 operators who died creating a diversion, about Rays who'd been hit during extraction, about the letter he'd written to Emma that Tors would now hopefully never have to mail. He thought about the fact that Earth was still here, still intact, and that the Dominion fleet was holding position at the edge of the solar system like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. I don't know, Marcus said finally, but we're still here. That counts for something. He closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion pull him under, and his last conscious thought was that maybe stubbornness wasn't the worst strategy after all, especially if the alternative was bending for people who'd never bothered to understand why you stood in the first place. The Dominion fleet departed 3 days later, their ships folding into whatever dimension they used for faster-than-light travel, and leaving behind a solar system that felt both emptier and more fragile than it had before their arrival. Earth's government scrambled to process what had happened, issuing statements that ranged from triumphant to bewildered to outright terrified, and the debate over whether humanity had won or simply delayed the inevitable raged across every news network and political forum. Marcus was discharged from the Dominion medical bay and transferred back to Earth, where military brass wanted to debrief him, and politicians wanted to parade him as proof of human resilience. He declined both, using medical leave as an excuse to disappear into the kind of anonymity that came from being just another veteran with scars and a limp. He flew to the East Coast, rented a car, and drove to the university where Emma was finishing her semester. She met him at a coffee shop near campus, the kind of place that served overpriced lattes and had furniture that looked like it had been salvaged from a thrift store. She looked older than he remembered, more confident, and when she saw him walk in she stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke on the word in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten. She crossed the distance between them and pulled him into a hug that was fierce enough to make his cracked rib protest, and he held her with the kind of desperate certainty that came from knowing how close he'd come to never seeing her again. They sat down, and Emma poured out questions that he answered as best he could without going into details that would give her nightmares. He told her about the mission in broad strokes, about the throne room and the message, and the fact that the Dominion had decided Earth wasn't worth the cost of conquering. He didn't tell her about the 4 operators who died, or the way his hands had shaken when he'd leveled his rifle at Velora, or the cold calculation that had gone into accepting a mission he'd known he probably wouldn't survive. "So what happens now?" Emma asked, and she was holding her coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Do we just go back to normal?" Marcus considered the question, looking out the window at the campus quad where students were walking between classes, talking and laughing like the world hadn't almost ended, and he realized that normalcy was a lie people told themselves to make the uncertainty bearable. The Dominion might be gone, but the galaxy was still out there, full of species and empires and threats humanity hadn't even begun to understand, and the best they could hope for was to be ready when the next crisis arrived. "We try," Marcus said, and he reached across the table to take Emma's hand. "We try to be better, stronger, smarter. We try to remember that we're still here because people chose to fight even when it looked hopeless. And maybe, if we're lucky, we figure out how to be the kind of species that doesn't just survive but actually deserves to." Emma squeezed his hand, and her smile was small but genuine. "That's a lot of trying, Dad." "Yeah," Marcus said, and he felt the weight of the past week settle into something he could almost carry. "But that's kind of our thing, isn't it?" They talked for another hour, about the fellowship and the reefs and the small, ordinary details of life that mattered more than any grand strategy or military victory. When they finally said goodbye, Marcus walked back to his rental car and sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the students move across the quad and thinking about the letter he'd written that Tors would never have to mail. He thought about Princess Velora and her final message, about the warning to teach humanity's children to be wary of the stars, and he decided that maybe being wary wasn't the same as being afraid. Maybe it just meant being smart enough to know that the universe didn't owe you safety or fairness or mercy, and that the only thing you could control was how you responded when it tested you. Marcus started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading south toward the base where Tors would be waiting with questions Marcus didn't have answers for. He thought about the next deployment, the next crisis, the next impossible mission that would require someone desperate or stupid enough to try, and he realized with a tired sort of clarity that he'd probably volunteer. Not because he wanted to die, but because someone had to stand in the gap between what humanity was and what it could become, and he'd already proven he was good at it. The stars above were bright and indifferent, and somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere, the Dominion fleet was spreading the word that humanity was marked as incompatible, a warning to themselves and to anyone else who might make the mistake of underestimating a species that chose spite over surrender. Marcus didn't know if that would be enough to keep Earth safe, but he knew it was better than nothing, and nothing had been the alternative just a week ago. He drove through the night, the highway stretching out before him like a promise, and he thought about Emma and the reefs and the stubborn, irrational hope that kept people moving forward even when the odds were impossible. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in a galaxy full of empires that measured their history in millennia, maybe something was all humanity needed to carve out a place worth defending. Tors met him at the base, standing outside the barracks with his hands shoved into his pockets, and an expression that suggested he'd spent the past week oscillating between grief and relief. When Marcus climbed out of the car, Tors straightened up and offered a salute that Marcus returned out of habit. "Gunny," Tors said, and his voice was steadier than it had been the last time they'd talked. "You made it back." "Yeah," Marcus said, and he clapped Tors on the shoulder in a gesture that was equal parts gratitude and apology. "I made it back." They walked into the barracks together, past bunks that belonged to people who weren't coming back, and Marcus sat down on his own bunk, where the letter to Emma was still sitting exactly where he'd left it. He picked it up, held it for a moment, then tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. Tors watched without speaking, and Marcus thought about explaining, about how the letter had been written by someone who'd expected to die, and how that person wasn't quite who he was anymore. But the explanation felt unnecessary. "What's next?" Tors asked, and Marcus heard the subtext beneath the question. What do we do with the fact that we're still here when others aren't? What do we do with the knowledge that the galaxy is full of things that want us gone? What do we do with the weight of surviving? Marcus stood, his cracked rib protesting, and he looked at Tors with the kind of certainty that came from having already made the decision. "We get ready," he said. "Because the Dominion might have backed off, but there's a whole galaxy out there, and we just made a lot of noise. Someone's going to come looking to see if we're as dangerous as Velora seems to think." Tors nodded, and Marcus saw the same stubborn resolve in the kid's face that had kept humanity stumbling forward through every extinction event and dark age. It wasn't bravery or heroism or any of the other words people like to use when they talked about soldiers. It was simpler and more fundamental, the refusal to accept that the universe got to decide when you stopped fighting. Marcus lay down on his bunk, staring at the ceiling and feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones like an old friend. He thought about Velora's warning, about teaching humanity's children to be wary of the stars, and he decided that maybe the best way to teach them was to show them that being wary didn't mean being passive. It meant being ready. It meant understanding that survival wasn't a right but a choice, and that every generation had to make that choice for themselves. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched out under a sky that held stars humanity was only beginning to understand. And Marcus closed his eyes and let the darkness take him, knowing that when he woke up there would be work to do, and a galaxy to navigate, and a species that was still figuring out its place in a universe that didn't care whether they succeeded or failed. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to be alive, to have made it back, and to know that somewhere on the East Coast, his daughter was studying reefs and planning a future that included hope rather than surrender. That was worth fighting for. That was worth bleeding for. And if the Dominion or anyone else came back thinking humanity could be dismissed as primitive or harmless, Marcus would be ready to remind them why underestimating deathworlders was a mistake empires only made once. The report filed by Captain Reyes 3 weeks after the incident noted that Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Hale had sustained injuries consistent with close-quarters combat, had successfully infiltrated a hostile command structure, and had transmitted intelligence that contributed to the strategic withdrawal of the Dominion fleet. The report was classified at the highest level, buried in databases that would remain sealed for decades, and the only people who read it were the ones who already knew what had happened. What the report didn't mention was the conversation Reyes had with Marcus after she was discharged from medical care, when she'd found him sitting alone in a rec room watching news footage of Earth's governments arguing over how to respond to the Dominion's departure. She'd sat down beside him, her shoulder still bandaged from the extraction wound, and asked him the question that had been bothering her since the mission ended. "Do you think she was telling the truth?" Reyes asked Velora when she said they wouldn't come back. Marcus had taken a long time to answer, watching the news anchors debate whether the Dominion's withdrawal represented victory or merely a postponement of the inevitable. "I think she believes it," he said finally. "Whether that's the same as truth depends on whether the rest of the Dominion agrees with her assessment. And if they don't, then we do it again," Marcus said, and his voice carried the kind of tired certainty that came from having already accepted the cost. "We make them bleed. We make them pay. We make it clear that taking Earth means losing something they're not willing to lose. It won't stop them forever, but it might buy us enough time to figure out how to stand on our own." Reyes had nodded, and they'd sat in silence for a while, two people who'd survived something they shouldn't have and were trying to make sense of what that survival meant. Eventually, Reyes stood, stretched, and said, "For what it's worth, Gunny, I'm glad you made it back." We need more people who know how to make the hard calls without pretending they're easy. Marcus had smiled at that, a small, tired expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thanks, Captain. I'll try to remember that next time someone asks me to do something impossible. The weeks turned into months, and life on Earth settled into a new normal that included watching the skies with a mix of wonder and wariness. Scientists worked to reverse engineer the limited data collected from the Dominion's technology. Military planners drafted new defense strategies that assumed the next invasion would be smarter and more prepared, and civilians went about their lives with the unspoken knowledge that the universe was bigger and more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Marcus returned to training rotations, working with young Marines who looked at him with a mix of awe and curiosity, having heard rumors about the mission that officially never happened. He didn't talk about it, didn't offer war stories or lessons learned, but he made sure the training was harder and more realistic than it had been before, pushing recruits to understand that surviving meant being willing to do things that looked impossible on paper. Emma completed her fellowship and published her first research paper on coral reef restoration, and Marcus read it twice even though most of the terminology went over his head. He kept a printed copy in his locker, tucked between a photo of his unit and the challenge coin he'd been given after his first deployment, and sometimes when the weight of what he'd seen felt too heavy, he'd pull it out and remind himself that the world still had people working to fix things, rather than just fighting to survive them. 6 months after the Dominion's departure, Earth's major governments convened a summit to establish unified defense protocols and coordinate research into technologies that might level the playing field if another advanced species decided humanity was worth conquering. The summit was held in Geneva, and Marcus was invited to attend as an advisor, though he suspected the real reason was that politicians wanted to be seen standing next to someone who'd proven humanity could punch above its weight class. He went, partly out of obligation and partly out of curiosity, and spent 3 days listening to diplomats debate whether Earth should pursue isolationism or attempt to establish contact with other species in the hope of building alliances. The debate was heated, full of passionate speeches and careful political maneuvering, and Marcus sat through most of it in silence, his presence more symbolic than functional. On the final day of the summit, a delegate from China approached him during a break and asked the question that had been circling through every conversation. "Do you think we're ready, Sergeant Hale, if they come back?" Marcus looked at the delegate, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of navigating political waters, and he gave her the most honest answer he could. "No," he said. "But we're more ready than we were 6 months ago, and we'll be more ready 6 months from now. That's the best we can do." The delegate had smiled at that, a small expression that suggested she'd expected a more reassuring answer but appreciated the honesty. "Then I suppose we keep working," she said, and Marcus nodded because there wasn't anything else to say. The summit ended with agreements that looked impressive on paper, but would take years to implement, and Marcus flew back to Nevada feeling like he'd wasted 3 days watching people argue over problems that didn't have clean solutions. But on the flight home, staring out the window at clouds that hid the ground below, he realized that maybe the point of the summit hadn't been to solve anything. Maybe it had been to prove that humanity could come together and try, even when the odds were stacked against them, and the path forward was unclear. When he landed, Torres was waiting at the airport with a message that had come through official channels. Princess Velora had sent a second communication, this one addressed not to governments but to Marcus personally. The message was brief, delivered via encrypted transmission that Earth's intelligence services had spent 2 days decoding, and it consisted of a single sentence. "Your species learns quickly. Teach them to be wise, not merely clever." Marcus read the message twice, trying to parse the meaning behind words that felt simultaneously like praise and warning, and he decided that Velora's perspective, shaped by 12 millennia of conquest and integration, probably included definitions of wisdom that humanity hadn't even begun to consider. But the fact that she'd bothered to send the message at all suggested that she was still watching,